Hey there. This is a video for Tammy, or inspired by Tammy's comment on the History Valley thread. We had a She made a nice comment, and it inspired me to reply, and so I thought I'd make a video reply out of our conversation. So I'll show you the conversation here now. Tammy said, "The kiss is the part that 100% gives it away as complete fiction. This is so much drama. Like, he can't just point him out to the Romans. And believe me, the Romans wouldn't have needed help finding him. Please. Even as a small child, I knew it wasn't a true story." So I thought that was a pretty awesome observation. And a bit later, I replied to that. "Tammy, major rituals come to Christianity through Mark's story and not vice versa. Baptism, Eucharist, Messiah, crucifixion, resurrection. Also, no one, including Paul, can have visions of Jesus Christ unless they know the story of Mark. The story came first." And a bit later, Tammy replied essentially, "I tend to believe, as the consensus does, that Paul's letters were written first, but I would be interested in hearing why you think that the reverse is true." And I say, yeah, I was with the consensus for a long time. So this video, or this discussion, is a follow-up to that thread, and hopefully I'll be able to share my views on this subject. So, where to begin? I'll start with a summary of what I call apologetic logic as far as the dating of the first Gospels. And basically it centers around the temple prophecy, or the prophecy of the temple destruction. Of course, apologists, believers, want Mark to be written as close to the events of Jesus, or the time of Jesus, meaning during time of Pilate. They want the gospel to be as near to that, so it could be as trustworthy or as true as possible, or as close to the real events as possible. So that's why an early dating of Mark from apologists would come from. Now, in contrast to that, the consensus logic is essentially a counter argument to that. Basically, scholars will typically date Mark post 70, meaning after the temple destruction, and it's an argument against prophecy. Essentially, it's an argument to refute an apologetic argument. So that's sort of why consensus scholars date Mark so much later than Pilate, say. So, what is the consensus view? In my understanding, it's something like there was a historical Jesus. There were a memory of his crucifixion. There were a memory on the part of his followers that he said certain things, and there developed saying traditions of what he said, and the essential element of his life on earth. And over time, rituals develop, and the story of his life and his sayings spread throughout the Roman Empire. And the rituals developed, and we eventually got an early church. And at some point, the church decided that they needed to write a story of their history, and that story that they wrote would be what we know essentially as the story in Mark, the Gospel of Mark. And so that's my understanding of the consensus view. What do I consider the shortcomings of the consensus view? And by the way, at the end I'm going to get to Paul, but it it's secondary. Paul coming after is secondary. What's primary is to understand that the rituals come out of the Gospel of Mark and not vice versa. As I said, uh, this is my theory. I'm expressing my views and my theory. So, what is the problem with the consensus view? What is difficult to imagine is that the church would develop and spread, and some form of a Eucharist, some form of a baptism, some form of a belief in the resurrection would exist, and that the fiction as we know it would be developed and written down, but those rituals are presented in the fiction in a more primitive sense or in a non-theological sense. And so my major hang-up on that consensus view is the idea that existing rituals, existing beliefs would be spread throughout the Roman Empire, and that a story would be written that would encapsulate those rituals, but in each case encapsulate it into a story in a more primitive or non-theological manner. Now, obviously, when you get into the other synoptics and finally John, you could see a development of increasing sophistication or an increasing theological understanding of the story. And so that's without a doubt occurring. So one analogy I'd like to give or think of is if you imagine a slope and you pour water on the slope, you expect the water to flow downhill in a downhill direction. And if you pour water on a slope and it goes uphill, you have to think something's fishy. There's something wrong with that. The natural direction of the flow of water is downhill, and we see that in the development from Mark into Matthew, Mark into Luke, and the addition of sayings or the cue source into Matthew and Luke. You see a natural flow in a certain direction. And when you think about Mark, if you think about the church or a primitive church having rituals developed, it's just really hard to imagine that they would write a story that goes in the opposite direction, and that they would circulate this story in an opposite direction, which doesn't help develop the theology or doesn't help improve understanding, but instead presents those rituals in a more primitive form. So that's my essential objection to the consensus view, or the part that really stumps me. It's a real hang-up to buy into that. So, I should say, getting back to an early dating of Mark, that I'm not an apologist. I came out of an evangelical upbringing background, so this is all of interest to me in that sense. So I don't make apologetic arguments. I don't argue for an early dating of Mark out of apologetic reasons, but instead out of fictional reasons, which is why I found your comment on the gospel being complete fiction so interesting, because it is in line with what I think as well. So now coming to how early could Mark be, or how early could the story of Mark be? Now, if you remove the idea of a historical Jesus and you just take the story of Mark and you chop it off, you forget about future developments, that would be Matthew, Luke, and ultimately John. You chop those off and you're just left with Mark, and you just think about that story is a fiction. How early can it be? Well, if there's no Jesus, it can go all the way back to the time of Pilate. And so I play with the idea of Mark being as early as the time of Pilate. Of course, apologists totally reject this, and critical scholars typically reject this. So I am in very much a very small minority in my view here. But I play with this idea as a theory. And so if you think about the story, and I see it as a polemic against the religious leaders, the temple, so to speak, or the religious authorities, I see it as a polemic against them more so than a polemic against, say, Rome or the Roman rulers, meaning Pilate. So, in that sense, I can't rule out the idea that the story could be written during the time of Pilate and not even subsequent to Pilate. So, in that sense, I work with the idea of a very, very early writing of Mark. I don't rule out something that could be called Proto-Mark in the sense that the version we have may not be 100% what was written at such an early date, because of course the manuscripts we have are quite a bit later, or the existing manuscripts are quite a bit later. So that gives a lower limit to the era of Mark, which of course is much earlier than apologists or scholars typically consider. Now then, what would be a typical objection to dating Mark so early? Well, it centers typically around the writings of Paul, and that one makes an argument that Paul doesn't seem to know the gospel narrative in Mark, and as a counter to that, certainly there was a community of believers before Paul. I mean, as the story goes, Paul was persecuting some form of a church, and I propose that this early church or early believers knew the story of Mark at a very, at least in a primitive form. Now, and of course, Paul persecuted this church and had a conversion. In my view, he knew the story and converted. Now, in his writings, he doesn't go on and on about the story, but he does develop the theology out of the story, mostly focus on the resurrection portion of Christ, and of course his own vision of Christ, which I don't really dispute. I think he did have visions of Christ, and his visionary experience is very similar to that of subsequent Christians throughout history who have visions of Christ or have a relationship with Christ, and get inspired by Christ through the Spirit, as it's typically stated. So what I don't want to say evidence, but what is my thinking on the idea that Paul knew Mark? It really centers around the fact that he had visions of Christ, and I almost take it as a sort of dogmatic thought or a dogmatic statement that no Christian through history or no believer can have a visionary experience of Christ without knowing the story, without knowing the fiction, is what I mean, without knowing the incredibly moving, dramatic, and tear-jerking story that is the story that we see in Mark. So that's the essential argument as to why I think the story of Mark was prior to Paul. And in fact, I'm of the opinion that the story of Mark is prior to anything that we could even call the church. So the all the rituals that we get or that we see develop in the early church come from the story itself. The story And the belief that the story had occurred in history is what turns the story of Mark into the Gospel of Mark. It's that belief that the story had happened recently in history that turns it into a gospel in my thinking or in my terminology. So when I speak of the story of Mark, I'm thinking of it as an original work by the author of a fictitious nature. And when that fiction became believed, that's when it sort of transforms into a gospel or the gospel in my mind. That's how I think of it. All right, so in summary, that's where my thinking is, why I think that Mark is early, and why it gave rise, why a belief in the fictitious story gave rise to the church and all the rituals, and to Paul's advancing theological notions of the story, what it means, what the resurrection meant. See, somebody has to give meaning to the story because the story in itself doesn't really have the meaning that it came to be understood, that came to be understood in the Christian church. And of course, the theological meaning that got attached to this original story developed over, first several hundred years of the church. And that is all development. It's New Testament development. It's the development of the early church. So, in summary, if one separates the origin of the early church from the development of the early church, I think that's a real key to separate the two, because of course the development is fascinating as well, and many books have been written on Paul and the early church, etc. So anyhow, that's my summary, my video summary of my thinking on that. I hope that made some sense, and it's not too wild and not too speculative, but of course it is at odds with apologetics, and it's at odds with a consensus view. Thank you for listening. Bye bye.